Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third semester of our Freedom School. My name is Dr. Leah T. Bascom, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Lakita Bennett Bailey, for organizing the Freedom School for these past 3 semesters, Jonathan Gales, the chair of our department, all of the people who have been participating for the past year and a half, and especially our co-sponsors and collaborators, Morris Gardner and everyone else at Auburn Avenue Research Library. It is my distinct honor tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Ms. Zena Z Sanders. I said I was going to keep this brief and I lied to myself, so I'm just going to jump straight in. I first met Zena Sanders in the spring semester of 2016, and she was enrolled in the Intro to Africana Studies, AAS 2010. At the time, she was an undergrad in film with a minor in Africana Studies. And I had been teaching the course for a few years at that point. And throughout the semester, she became central to one of the most cohesive classroom communities that I can remember. Folks learned from each other, they disagreed with each other, they hashed it out respectfully. We were able to do some things in other classrooms that wouldn't happen just because everybody came and showed up for each other in that way. And that's what happened in the classroom. But her work was also amazing, right? And had I never met her again, I would always have remembered her final paper, which was on Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. And that was the beginning of my understanding of how she would use popular Black culture in politics and her level of analysis. But I did get to work with her again 2 years later in a Black iconography course. And she kept doing it, right? She used for her presentation one of the most famous images of Black power, the Huey P. Newton poster. And for those of you who haven't seen it, look it up because you will find it everywhere. And she broke it down in ways that someone like myself who has seen it millions of times and heard it analyzed millions of times, she brought something new to it, right? But it was her final paper that was most impressive. Right? And in it, she started to look at some of the most urgent images of the time, especially thinking about Ferguson, thinking about what it means to be in front of a camera, thinking about whose camera is doing the looking, thinking about who is rewarded for looking and who is rewarded for capturing moments, right? And what does it mean to see pain? How do people relate to it and in what ways, right? And so she worked on that project for some years. It became her master's thesis, and I was, privileged enough to continue to work with her as she entered into our MA program. And the level of analysis just kept going. It went from, a few images of Ferguson to entire archives of images of protests for the past, 10 years, right? And one of the things I enjoyed the most working with Scholar Sanders is her work ethic, right? Her ability to continually surpass herself, her ability to do the intellectual work, the reading, the writing, the critical thought, and also all of the emotional work that comes with that, the working through the doubt, the making sure that you're on point, the being okay with messing up so that you can keep going and keep working, right? And so I am pleased to say that now, after earning a BA and an MA from GSU, and here's the official biography, she is now a Berkeley Fellow and doctoral student in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research explores the visual representation of anti-Blackness across the diaspora in film, digital media, news, art, and popular culture. Broadly, her research interests include performances of race, gender, and sexuality in media and popular culture, Black visuality and Black gaze, Black radical thought, memory and materiality, the historical narratives and legacies of Black movements, and the visual cultures of Black resistance they produced. Specifically, she's interested in the political aesthetics and poetics of Black resistance that emerge within Black liberation struggles and the ways Black artists, cultural workers, and their audiences engage in practices of imaging, remembering, and imagining Black freedom struggles as part of a liberatory practice. Right? There's a lot of big words and small words there. Tonight, she's going to give you an example of what all of that means with this presentation titled Imaging Insurrection, Protest, Photography, and the Visual Framing of Black Resistance in Black Lives Matter Era. Her work focuses on how protest movements are framed by media outlets through photography and the narrative surrounding it. She looks at how Black Americans look at and look back at these images. From Ferguson to Baltimore to Minneapolis, she draws on histories of Black struggle in order to read our current moment. She asks her audience, what does it mean to look? How is protest framed and by who? In what ways does power appear and how is it captured in photographic moments? What is at stake in seeing and recognizing Black value? And what does liberation look like? So with that, Scholar Sanders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bascom, for such an amazing introduction. It's hard to go behind Leah T. Bascom, y'all, but I'm gonna make it do what it do. You know, I do use a lot of big words, but quite simply, one of the things that continues to animate my thinking is, what do we do with the image? And though that has been sort of the central consideration the entire time, I can't help but to continue to sort of trouble it. I can't help but to think about what it means to continue to go back and to look forward and understand our current and contemporaneous struggles through a narrative of our history. What this history, particularly the visual history, has to teach us about Black Lives Matter, but in specifics, but also what it has to teach us about the history of Black political struggle in the United States is really where I find myself focused right now, but we certainly must understand that any history of Black political struggle necessarily expands beyond these national borders. As Dr. Bascom alluded, I came to this particular question or these particular sets of questions following my encounter with scenes of social unrest in Ferguson following the murder, the extrajudicial killing of Michael Brown. And I haven't been able to look away, quite honestly. And so what I've spent a lot of time doing over the last couple of years is thinking through what it means to look, what it means to not look away, and all of the politics that are wrapped up in visibility and the ways in which, you know, this is used, and all of the things that are inscribed onto Black bodies. And how that is truly influencing our understandings, one, of, you know, movement efficacy, but also personal efficacy. Individually, how do we show up? How do we go from passive lookers and spectators to people who are actively engaged in the work of liberation? And so those are kind of the larger meta thoughts that hang over this study. And so with that being said, I'd like to begin with some words that I've prepared to help me stay on course. It is necessary to understand that any society with a history of oppression is also a society with a history of resistance. Protest photography stages a visual encounter with the image of Black rebellion that foregrounds and stages a visual encounter with a fragmented history of Black resistance and political struggle. Protest photography mediates this encounter and produces a visual language that is used to articulate contested narratives of Black political struggle. This encounter is effective. Affective, meaning that it is charged, that it produces and triggers both memory and emotion. The image can be said to speak. It resonates, it ruptures, and it wounds. Perhaps when activated in the right circumstances, the image has the capacity to heal. More simply stated, images, like words, following in the thinking of J.L. Austin, do things. Protest photography captures Black suffering and resistance within the public sphere and makes it material. The photographic images of protest and urban rebellion visually suture the historical continuity of Black suffering and resistance across space and time in order to produce these visual narratives of a long Black freedom struggle. And for me, this becomes really important to identify and begin to connect with in order to start to make sense of the way we see this image used contemporaneously. As performative documents of historical evidence and objects of material culture, protest photography carries social histories and cultural memories that mediate the ways Black protests are studied as events within the historical timelines of Black political struggle, and the ways in which they're also further analyzed as socio-political phenomenon, performative acts, and public rituals. The communicative and cultural affordances of photography shapes how protest is represented, remembered, and understood by audiences. But I must warn you, however, there is a problem with the image. It speaks in many tongues, its meanings are never fixed, and its uses and circulation come with consequences. Encapsulated within these images is a politics of disposability that moves through a political and a visual economy that scholar Clorinde Peters refers to or argues is a certain type of economy that renders certain people or populations less valuable, ungrievable, and even able to be killed without consequence. As evidenced through the ever expanding, horrific American genre of Black death as snuff. The photographic representations of Black protest is always already arriving and operating within a semiotic discourse of racialized visual grammar that is subsequently then broadcast through news media, circulated through popular culture, institutionalized in archives, and forever lodged into our collective memories. So what does protest photography tell us about our history? That's one question. Scenes of social unrest in Ferguson, 2014, Baltimore, 2015, Minneapolis, and beyond in 2020 are said to have sent shockwaves across the nation that reverberated around the world. Was it the visualization of a militarized police force occupying communities across America? Perhaps. Perhaps it was the horrific enactments of anti-Black violence that left many in dismay. Perhaps it was the encounter with Black death and what Jennifer C. Nash refers to as the attendant affects of grief and loss that accompanied the image upon its arrival. Maybe those were the things that left you traumatized and triggered on site. Alternatively, there are those who desire to consume the image, to consume the Black body as flesh, to consume Black pain and suffering as a panacea for the social ills and anxieties resulting from the Eurocentric hierarchical structures that interact to form a constellation of systemic oppression, something that Patricia Hill Collins reminds us or refers to as the work of the matrix of domination that affects all of our lives. Like many of you, I too am troubled by the image and its memories that haunt it. My own encounter with the scene of social unrest emanating from Black Lives Matter held me as a witness and motivated this research inquiry. The encounter interpolates the viewer. There really is no escaping that. And I argue this for particularly Black viewers. In thinking of the ways that visuality and visibility mediate encounters with Black protest in particular, this study engages with the material and visual cultures of protest photography as an important site of convergence through which social, cultural, and political meanings of protest are constituted, constructed, and communicated. So, encountering the problem of uprisings in media is necessarily encountering the problem of representation. And I'm compelled by the nagging questions of what to do with the image, how we study it, what can it tell us about Black political struggle, how does it inform our understandings of the histories of resistance embedded within the narratives, memories, and myths of Black freedom struggles throughout the 20th and 21st centuries? How is this image being used as evidence and artifact? Who is using it? And for what purpose? Who and what becomes visible within the archive? Who and what is erased or otherwise marked illegible within the archive and its silences? What radical possibilities become available through the retrieval and the reuse of the image? But also, and maybe quite important, is the issue of what is the image's inherent limitations. Additionally, there are questions about ethics, questions that become very important and worthy of careful consideration, because those of us who encounter the images of Black resistance reproduced and remediated as hyper-visual media spectacle must attend to the influence of power in the image making, circulation, and archival processes. And the ways in which that power is showing up is certainly having an impact on public opinion and public discourse. And so it is here that I turn my attention towards questions of representation, of Blackness, and protests that proliferated through news media and social media channels. This has been through the period following the 2014 uprisings in Ferguson, all the way forward into the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd last year. And I'm asking, in what ways are these images being used to frame discourses and influences, or excuse me, and influence public opinion around Black-led social movements and their aims? In a 2017 Newman report, Tara Pixley highlights the significance of the problem. With race and representation in news media, she argues that the ways visual journalists represent and reproduce race has not received extensive analysis or critique within the field of journalism. Furthermore, a well-documented media bias is present in terms of reporting on Black protests, and this warrants an interrogation of the ways power shapes the construction of dominant narratives of Black resistance within these discourses. Collectively, these questions, along with others, such as what is just, how do we grieve, how do we mourn, how do we heal, that are also a part of this discourse that floats through media, through popular culture, through art, everywhere in our own interpersonal conversations. These become the sort of collective questions and concerns that substantiate the need for further critical examination of the visual practices employed in the representation of social protest and their potential to influence our collective understanding of this socio-political phenomenon. So in conducting this research, I had particular goals and aims that I was hoping to flesh out. I started this project really thinking about like agency, where the agency showed up. And quite honestly, there was all kinds of agency being performed by all types of people. So that wasn't narrow enough. So the aims of imagining and imaging, reads insurrection as I would call it, are to explore how protest is visually represented through these framing practices, right? To further sort of help us understand how the audiences then therefore articulate or perform their own agency in the ways in which they respond to these representations. And then it's also quite necessary, I think, as an intervention to begin to interrogate the dominant, that's a misspelled word, narrative around the visualization of Black protests. Imaging insurrection, protest, photography, and the visual framing of Black resistance interrupts the dominant representation and remediation of social protests, and it interrogates these narratives that have been inscribed within the scopic regimes that constrict the visuality of Black resistance. Essentially, all those words simply mean that power shows up and dictates what we see when we see Black resistance, and that has an impact. This research highlights the role of power in the construction of these narratives and the ways in which it produces absences, silences, and excesses that are found in the visual archive. The study operationalizes a critical Black gaze and collective memory as methods that promote the articulation of Black experiential knowledge, the lived experience of Black folks, that disrupts the dominant narrativization of Black freedom struggles. I'm getting tongue-tied. Such disruption draws from standpoint theory to center Black voices and experiences the mediated visual encounters of Black resistance. And this knowledge is being put to use in service of gaining valuable understanding on how audiences respond to the image and why. The study aims to elucidate the influence of the photographic framing on the perceptions of collective identity, movement, efficacy, and anger within a cross-generational sample of a Black audience. And this becomes really significant because I'll go a little bit more deeply in terms of the makeup of that audience when I talk about methods. But I felt it important in order to think about a Black Lives Matter moment. I wanted to situate this conversation amongst people who were born after a post-civil rights and a post-Black power moment. I just simply argue that protest is something that is a moment of Black protest in particular, political socialization for all of us. And so we remember Rodney King and we remember the LA Rebellion as we remember the Watts Rebellion before that, and as we remember the Long Hot Summer. And these memories of mine are second memories from a previous generation. They certainly influence my understanding of not only this moment and also of the history itself, but I think it's somewhat problematic if we continue to not really look closely at the ways in which the histories of those moments also are being used to influence the way we understand this particular moment that we're in. And you probably have noticed or can relate to this in your own conversations with people in your own lives around the ways in which people critique Black Lives Matter, what's appropriate forms of resistance, what is the right way to protest. I'm almost inclined to say that there is no right way, but that is almost a conversation for another day. um, this study is really guided by the understanding, though, of the role of audience as these active participants who are engaged in the constructions of meanings, of meaning making as a process in general. But the meaning of protest is something that's actively being constructed across all audiences and all agents who are engaging with the image. And the voices of the audience in this particular study become central to the research findings on the effects of photographic framing, on, on the practices of interpretations of visual representation, and what all of that has to do with helping us understand moments of social unrest that occurred in Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and beyond. I am situated and thinking very deeply about these particular sites because I argue that something significant happened in those moments, but it's certainly not something that is limited to these locations. This research further endeavors to provide an in-depth analysis of both media and movement framing practices. So essentially, again, the way in which the news media is taking up this image and the way in which they're talking about it, the way in which they're using the image themselves to frame other discourses. But then also there's this whole other separate conversation that's going on that was traveling through a lot of digital social media spaces, a lot of public spaces around the images themselves, whether or not they were promoting certain types of harm, the ethics around who was using the images and where. And so these are all the type of things that are really beginning to animate my discoveries, if you will. And so I'm drawing on particular data sets here in which we're looking at all of these archives. I looked at an abundance of images, but I was particularly focused on professional photojournalist images and those that sort of circulated through these sort of official channels, right? There is a possibility certainly that citizen journalism and the way in which regular folk with cell phone cameras are out here in the streets and using that technology to document also becomes another space to look at, but it's not one that I approach within the body of this work, but I also argue it is something that we need to turn our attention toward as well. And in addition, with looking at these photographs, particularly across 4 digital online photo albums that had been archived by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the case of Ferguson, ABC News, as well as CNN. I also look at I also engage in focus group discussion, and I'm trying to bring again this notion of people's understanding and people's lived experience together to help me read against the archive. The study begins to offer critical insight on how photography materializes the social and political conditions of social unrest. And it also considers the ways that these factors influence audience perception as well. The research provides a crucial understanding for how photography and framing practices facilitate the mediation of individual, collective, social, and public memories of Black political struggle. So again, when we see that image of a 1967 moment reemerging in 2015 or 2020, that happens because of a reason. There are connections that are being made there that I argue that we have to investigate. And doing this type of work highlights the relationship between media and memory and performance. And it begins to address a gap in the existing literature on movement studies and critical media studies. The study highlights the cultural role, the culture and the political role of protest photography as a form of documentary that operates as a material artifact and a mnemonic device. And in this sense, photography provides historical evidence of Black political struggle and serves as a conduit of cultural and social memory. Photography supports this memory flow from one generation to the next, and it enables Black witness spectators to engage in a process of retrieval, of interrogation, and utilization of cultural memory to collectively recall and commemorate these struggles. And the study does then also combine sociological research on the relationship between visual media, framing, and memory, and their influence on public perceptions of social issues and performances of resistance, as well as the social actors who engage with them. And it also begins to contribute to the development of new paradigms for looking, new modes of analysis and visual inquiry in the study of African-American social movements and diasporic Black liberation struggles in the 21st century. A few notes on theory, positionality, and assumption. The study is guided by an interpretive lens of critical race theory and dramaturgy. The study also incorporates or employs standpoint theory, which considers social location. And this is something that becomes really important in my analysis as an integral part in understanding how we are materially affected individually and collectively by the multiple aspects of our identity. And I draw on standpoint theory to emphasize that the experiential knowledge of Black audiences is entangled with the historical and cultural conditions that we live in, as well as the relations to power and subordination that shape Black people's lived experiences with race, gender, sexuality, and ability. From my own standpoint and social location, I theorize as a Black queer woman situated within the so-called middle age and middle class demographics. And I'm also, as a researcher, very much so situated in this process as a participant observer. And I bring my intersectional identity and lived experience with anti-Blackness through both interpersonal encounters as well as media encounters to bear in my analysis of the visual mediums that codify race as a social construct through ways of seeing. And my approach to audience reception is influenced by social constructivist worldview. Again, the wisdom and knowledge gained from living this life in this Black body and the cultural competency that goes along with it as a scholar and cultural producer who has learned through the interrogation of these images and the relationship between media and power that my own survival requires that not only I live and study these type of mediated encounters, but also that I study quite seriously the encounter with dominant representations of Blackness through a critical gaze. And this is a gaze, one in which Bell Hooks describes as one that looks to document and one that is oppositional. The critical gaze here is operationalized in my own readings of protest imagery and those of the study's participants as a means of contextualizing the condition of Black life that produces and animates the modes and methods by which Black people struggle for liberation and self-determination. And I want to stop there just to say the performances of resistance that we see are learned behavior. They get iterated over and over again. They get passed on from one generation to the next. So when we start to think about the value and what it means to remember and what it means to look back and the ways in which that informs our own understanding of the way in which we're struggling today, this becomes very important to study the history. The research also addresses multiple audiences, right? Without a doubt, it's written and primarily thinking about an academic audience that traditionally privileged institutional knowledge and written text over other forms of knowing. But in the context of this discussion tonight, the audience also likely includes students and faculty members and affiliates in the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State, archivists, researchers, curators, programmers, and staff in connection and affiliation with the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and members of a general public who also, like me, could not escape the proliferation of these images, not just last year, but probably for a very long period of time. They've shown up in your memory and certainly in your media. We form a group that is very diverse with varied interests and backgrounds, and this ultimately will influence how we engage this topic tonight. All of our insights, though, are important, and they hold a potential to produce a people's knowledge that is capable of being utilized with our ongoing struggles towards self-determination. So the literature review, for all those who have done research, we know that that's kind of the low down dirty, where we go into the history where people have began to think about these questions before. And so the literature that I take up is organized quite thematically around protest and the long Black freedom struggle. Here, I am really wanting to think about what it means to visualize a Black protest tradition, and think about the ways in which photography has been implicated within the historiography of civil rights and Black power movements. And so there have been amazing historians, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, our very own Akinyele Emoja, Charles Cobb, all these people who have done the very necessary work to trouble the historiography. Where does it begin? You know, this dominant narrative that it begins with essentially Rosa Parks performing a particular act of resistance, and then Black civil rights then therefore ends with, you know, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And then where does Black power begin? You know, people who have had to really go and think about that quite literally around it as a separate movement, but that also as a movement that has histories rooted far prior to not only civil rights. And all these histories within our political struggles have a certain continuity with strains of Black political thought that have been produced and being developed throughout our time here in this settler colony that we call the United States of America. And when we look into this history, if we particularly look at the visual narratives around it, we begin to see certain tactics that get used, and we begin to see certain conversations that emerge around the appropriateness of nonviolence versus armed self-defense. And so it's something that also then again shows back up in this Black Lives Matter moment. And then photography is something that we can see as sort of circulating this image when Dr. Bascom alluded to a previous research project where I look at the very iconic image of Huey P. Newton, and the ways in which it then gets used in popular culture. It was such a groundbreaking moment for me because, again, the history was being taught, but were we actively engaging with it? And then also what history was being taught, you know, that becomes a point that we have to really interrogate. Next, I think I move on into the section around protest, performativity, and photography. And so here I'm looking at some performance theory to help me understand not only the image as a document, but the way in which it is made to work. And what we can learn from that, right? The way in which protest itself becomes a type of public performance, a public performance of memory, a public performance of resistance, a public performance of mourning. And, you know, all of this really gets extended through photography as a type of performative document. And so we look at, again, some scholars who have been studying movement culture and thinking about the ways in which it flows. And, you know, that this really sort of helps me understand and ground what is happening with photography in terms of its circulation and what the implications of that might mean. And then I look at photography and the visual sites of resistance. And this becomes one of the things where I really want to look at what gets performed within the image. You know, here we see a die-in. You're examining what happens with these images is that they actually become image events and they take on a certain life of their own. And in order to think about that and in order to study that critically, we need to think about the way in which the image is framed, okay? How protest image events are taken up by the people who make the image, how the way they're taken up and circulated by the people who are really just out here trying to fight for justice and liberation. But then also what becomes really important to me is the role of Black spectatorship. And so when we're thinking about framing processes and the ways in which they work, and the way in which the movements themselves evoke the image, then it becomes really almost quite clear the need to study the image in the ways in which we understand movement messaging, right, as a communicative type of process, and what that can help us understand about the study of social movements in general. Visual framing of protest photography is something that, anyone can do. So again, it's not just something that happens in the media. It's not just simply something that the audience does not have a potential to resist against. And so I'm really looking at the ways in which we can trouble the image and come to understand the work that it is doing. And this becomes quite necessary when you think about spectatorship. And so this process of reading, reframing, and remembering as a function of Black spectatorship is something that I end upon prior to going into my methods section. And, I think this one is probably I can't say the most important section of the research, but it is one in which I was really invested in. A lot of scholars who have informed my work, like Lee Rayford, who have called for a expansion of the canon, that it is the canon that we come to understand as protest photography in relation to like the civil rights movement. And they all begin to start to articulate like what it means for Black people, particularly, to see this image, what it means for us to encounter it, and what it is that we do with it, right? And so even here we see, what is a historical image and also a contemporary one that has been made Black and white, a certain type of framing that's happening that should bring our attention to, again, this notion of a historical continuity. So why are these images placed together? This is the type of work that I'm asking the audience to do when we think about what it means to engage in critical practices of looking. Oops. All of these questions, or all of these pieces of literature are being placed together in conversation with each other to help me identify and really come to address these three primary research questions. How are photographic images of Black resistance and political dissent used by media? Again, I'm talking particularly news media, and you also used by social movement actors, organizers, just regular folk, to visually frame and represent protest events. Additionally, how is memory evoked, right? So what is the role of memory in all of this? And how is it being used to create particular narratives or counter narratives around Black political struggle in the Black Lives Matter era and beyond, because we can also say that that works retroactively. Finally, how do Black spectator audiences as social actors engage and interpret and respond to these representations? And, what do we do? What do we do from there? So a few notes on methods. I do a two-stage type of analysis where I'm looking at both content analysis of the image themselves, and then I'm also engaged in focus group discussion, and then I look at discourse analysis of those transcripts. And I'm thinking actually with them both together almost simultaneously to help us understand the meanings that are being communicated through these various uses of photography. Notes on findings, and I'm going to try to move through this a little bit. Well, before I get to that point, I think it's important to say a little bit more about the method. In employing this two-stage strategy, I'll go back one slide. I do this in order to examine the representations of Ferguson, Baltimore, and Minneapolis protest events at the site of both the image and its reception upon arrival. And this strategy builds from previous research observations on the use of visual methodology in social science research, which, is not something, let me be quite clear, is not something that, people are doing because of the trouble with the image, because of the subjective nature in reading the image. People, particularly like historians, and then, even in the sociological perspective that moves around social movement studies, and even thinking about framing, people more often are thinking about discourse, they're thinking about text, about written text, and not about the ways in which the image actually arrives as a type of text within itself. And so I sort of built this type of two-stage analysis, following in the thinking of scholar Gillian Rose, who contends that the best visual methods for image-based research reflect the specific needs of the research questions and correspond to the sites of interpretive analysis of concern to the study. So it wasn't enough to just go through this process of looking at all these images and reading them. And for me to come up with these meanings or these my own interpretations of what they must mean. I actually chose to suspend my own readings temporarily to think through them with the audience participants, which I think becomes a very important intervention and innovation of this research itself. Imaging insurrection then, in this context, utilizes content analysis to therefore identify how Black resistance, political dissent, and performances of contentious politics are visually represented through the news media, and collective action visual framing of Black protest strategies, of the tactics that are being used, the rituals that are being performed, and that all these things become visible within this Black Lives Matter moment. And the second stage of analysis actually stages an encounter with an image and uses photo elicitation with these focus group participants to identify particular themes of audience response. And all of this essentially comes back to these initial questions that I'm seeking to answer. And I'm quite interested in what it means to think about how we read the image. I'm interested in what the image represents to the viewer and how the viewer interprets or otherwise responds to the image. This again becomes a critical exercise in the practice of looking, which is a method and a tool for analysis and interpretive meaning making. And the objects of study in this research I mentioned previously include, these sort of broad data sets of images. They're certainly not the only images. All of the images proliferate through everywhere. So it's probably quite impossible to settle on any one. So these became important because, they were really just where I entered. The Ferguson and Picture Archive was one of the first things that I started to study after really being held by the image of Michael Brown's body laying in the middle of Canfield Drive. And this is an image that I can't escape. And it was situated as the first image in this archive by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And so that really influenced the way that I went about searching for other images as it related to the Baltimore uprisings, as well as the Minneapolis uprisings of last year. And so during a period of analysis, I look at these images individually and in conversation with each other and thinking through both their denotative meanings and the practices of framing that are present, the sequence of image selection and the frequency of appearance. And throughout this process, certain visual patterns began to emerge within the development of what we could consider a visual discourse on Black protest in the Black Lives Matter era. Within these discursive patterns are historical patterns of representations and narratives that form connections between contemporary performances of protest and the performances of contentious politics during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement that occurred in the 20th century. And that brings us to this space to think about findings and the insights that we gain from them. The study, again, examined this protest photography from these 4 archives: Ferguson in Pictures, Dramatic Images from Baltimore, Black Lives Matter, A Movement in Photos, and In Pictures, A Racial Reckoning in America. And the photography reproduced performances of Black resistance and political dissent through a visual representation of protesters engaged in contentious politics. Embodied acts of resistance are visible in forms of violent and nonviolent direct action. The findings from the visual content analysis reveal that news media uses a protest paradigm, which is something that previous research had already identified. But one of the things that I was able to do in looking at these data sets was also to begin to understand that they were primarily representing Black resistance and political dissent that included these spectacular performances, these spectacular scenes of violence. You've seen them. You've seen the fire. You know, you've seen it all. I have intentionally left those images out of this part of the slideshow because I don't want to overwhelm my audience. And so within all these scenes, the property destruction, the looting, but then there's also these scenes of public mourning that become quite intriguing. The Ferguson and Baltimore rebellions are episodically framed through the Ferguson in pictures and dramatic images from Baltimore. So it's just those two archives only look at those specific events. And it's the way in which they present the image to the viewer is that of an episode, right? So a beginning, a middle, and an end. And here, what we begin to see is that Black resistance against the militarized police force becomes visible through the performances of Hands Up, Don't Shoot, direct confrontations with police, and acts of armed self-defense. Public visuals for Michael Brown and rituals of mourning were the most visible within this set. And also comparatively, with the other three archives, you know, the notion of protest as an act of mourning is a primary stage of representation. So this is something that's very unique around this particular group of pictures. The dramatic images from Baltimore represented Black resistance as rebellion that produced destruction and gave way to acts of looting and social disorder. So a completely different narrative that gets taken up within that data set. And in many ways, this narrative is also connected to a history of rebellion in Baltimore that occurred again in this notion of a long, hot summer. Scenes of public mourning in Baltimore in the Baltimore archive were less visible, but acts of solidarity between protest demonstrators and police were recurring themes that emerge within this visual representation. And this becomes, it's a bit of a shift in what we see from the Ferguson archive. And this, I believe, becomes something that will be significant when we get to a racial reckoning in America. The Black Lives Matter, a movement in photos, is one that is archived by ABC News. And, you know, I don't mind actually, if I have a chance, I'll try to put links in the chat if you guys are interested in actually looking at the archives as they exist online today. But both the Black Lives Matter, a movement in photos, and the In Pictures, a racial reckoning in America, thematically frame Black Lives Matter. So the emergence of the movement itself through visual depictions of Black resistance in the form of embodied protest, raised fist, taking a knee, rallies, demonstrations, die-ins. Also visible within these spaces is the emergence of a multiracial crowd or a coalition of allies that take to the streets to demonstrate in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Again, they're featured in all of these spaces are the spectacular scenes of property destruction caused by violent fires. The fire-ravaged built environment becomes the mise-en-scene, and the images from the In Pictures archive work to present Minneapolis uprisings and the national wave of protest demonstrations through a lens of racial solidarity. So again, also a very significant shift when we think about that in terms of a 2020 moment and compare that to the emergence of Black Lives Matter mobilizing in the streets in Ferguson in 2014. That notion of a multiracial coalition was not one that was as visually present. And there was also, again, just a lot of public discourse and pushback on Black Lives Matter. We still contend with people who feel that they need to rebut that with all lives matter or blue lives matter and whatever that is. You know, in the 2020 moment, you see much more solidarity, which I think is quite interesting. And it's really sort of indicative of how far the movement itself has advanced. But also, you can't separate the social condition of the pandemic from really influencing the way in which that wave of protest activity takes shape. And while the efficacy of symbolic actions of resistance is debated among the study's participant audience members, the imagery of solidarity that are presented or shown in these glimpses of this multi-racial coalition becomes more and more prevalent, you know, in this CNN archive, which is like 200 pictures. We see performative gesturing as Black, white, and other non-Black POC community members place their bodies in perilous positions to actively demonstrate against police brutality and anti-Black state violence. Additionally, the In Pictures archive is the only album that shows non-Black victims of police force and state violence, and this is quite a significant break from the others. Previous research indicated that news media widely and liberally applied the protest paradigm to delegitimize Black protest and claims making. And this study's findings illustrate that the presence of a visual protest paradigm undergirds the frame selection, the sequencing, and amplification processes used by news media to visually represent Black Lives Matter protest events through image frames of violence and mourning. In conversation with critical media studies, communication studies, and social movement studies, this research elucidates the ways news media and social movement actors utilize this imagery to frame Black resistance toward their own goals and toward their own gains. I would say many of you probably remember as we turned toward election season last year, the way that image became, the image of uprisings became weaponized by the GOP to do a particular kind of work. And so this is what I mean. The image itself is polyvalent. The image itself is polyvocal. Anybody can take one image and add and put meanings onto it, but then the audience then therefore sitting in their own position can contest those meanings. And so the audience coming back to them as power agents becomes a very important place that we want to think about the ways in which we're engaging with this conversation. And moving toward the focus group conversations and thinking about audience, again, situating this audience. Everybody was between the ages of 18 and 55, post-civil rights generation, hip hop generation, millennials, and the Gen Zs. I hear the Gen Zs are referring to the 1980s and 1990s as the late 1900s, and well, you know what we said about that. So, but this audience, you know, was very diverse. It was, you know, filled with, I would probably say a little bit more in terms of gender representation. It skewed a little bit more representative of Black women's voices than Black men's voices. And so when I was engaged in these focus group conversations, I really wanted to make sure with a lot of intentionality that I was engaging both of those groups, and then also engaging across generational demographics, across Gen X, across Gen Y, across Gen Z, to get to some sort of shared understandings amongst the groups, but then also what kind of intergenerational flow of meaning was being exchanged. And this is what made the focus group conversation really unique and really impactful, because we were really able to talk about the image in ways that I'm not sure people get to do on a daily basis. And I believe that, we experienced a lot of breakthroughs around that. And there was a lot of critiquing of media representation, which becomes, it remains something that's very important and of interest to me. And then also, though, there was also a space where people really began to think about the ways in which they had been impacted, the harm certain encounters caused, the reasons why they would or would not look, these sort of acts of refusal that people talk about. You may have noticed it in social media discourse around, whether we should look, whether we should share that image or not, what harm it's doing. And these become very important questions that came up within the focus group discussions. And in staging these encounters with the archives, I was able to identify, or at least observe, the ways that Black audiences negotiated with the image, its representation, and its signified meanings. Here, the audience, situated as agent, acts as an active participant in the construction of these meanings. And these participants provided invaluable knowledge from their individual and collective standpoints that is extremely useful when considering what to do with the image. The critical discourse analysis further illustrated how audiences address the role of protest photography in the following thematic areas of race, resistance, and visual representation, performativity, visibility, and social recognition, visuality, protest and mourning, visuality, memory, and remediated trauma, and Black spectatorship, testimony, and witnessing. The findings suggest that Black spectator audiences engage, interpret, and process images and imaginings of resistance and social unrest as a response to Black crisis. The participants' responses reveal that meaning is derived and filtered through the lens of our collective experiences of surviving racial terror and attending to the trauma of the afterlives of slavery. The knowledge generated from the audience's standpoints retrieves and creates counter narratives, produces alternate framing paradigms, initiates a type of truth telling through testimony. And all of this happens in part of a project of remembering and retelling, which is crucial for the act of bearing witness. And on this notion of witnessing, it becomes something that one must choose. One must choose to take this active position. Everyone will not make that choice. Everyone cannot make that choice all of the time. And so this is a space of negotiation that people have to contend with. And it's quite interesting in seeing the ways in which these audience members did this for themselves. And I was very moved by their honesty and their vulnerability in the ways in which they talked about their experiences.
Scholar Sanders, we do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yep, I'm moving toward conclusion. In keeping with that, this really is conclusion. I would say I want to end by underscoring the need that is expressed for community ethics, for mutual aid, and a politics of care that is activated through a critical practice of Black spectatorship, one that is built on the foundations of what Courtney R. Baker refers to as a humane insight, and one that works in service of that which scholar Christina Sharp refers to as wake work. And in thinking again about this role of spectatorship, Lee Rayford describes Black spectatorship as the modes and paths by which Black viewers navigate a hostile representational terrain that is structured in dominance. And throughout this research, I was able to identify the techniques, the technologies, the strategies and tactics that were subsequently preserved and retransmitted through these acts of witnessing, remembering, and retelling. And this is a type of critical spectatorship that is actively engaged in the process of self-determination and freedom making. With the final thought, I will end in saying and thinking about what we've learned and how we use what we learn and what we do from here. The performances of critical Black spectatorship that engage with these representations produce a type of negotiated and oppositional narrative. They activate a critical gaze. They bear witness to Black death and dying by the state, and they're undergirded by the critical race and standpoint theories. Herefore, we have this testimony that becomes available that gives life and truth to the culpability of institutional power and the suppression of Black political agency. It becomes quite important that we begin to think closely around what it means to interrogate these archives and what it means to do this active work of remembering and using this work in the way in which we come to understand and continue to study the movement for Black lives, Black liberation, and Black resistance in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Scholar Sanders. So as the Q&A questions come in, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and start off. I'm going to start where you ended and also where you began. You talk about the work of witnessing, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that is and how it differs between, showing up in the live real-time moment versus witnessing through photography in a much different space.
For sure. So this notion of witnessing, we hear it a lot, and I appreciate that question. And a lot of people talk about like, oh, it's important for us to bear witness, or what it actually means to do that. And this really is a form of looking as analysis. It's a form of historical critique. It is a form of retrieving a certain type of knowledge, a certain type of history that is often suppressed. And then it's saying very, I think honestly, that the image itself requires a response, but not only the image. I mean, there are other people who would say the very act of anti-Blackness requires a response. And so when we see it, then what do? Do we simply see it and say, okay, that happened, and now, I'm going on to, wherever I'm going and whatever am I doing? Or do we actively sit with it? And so the forms of witnessing that I'm talking about here are related to what it means to sit with the image, what it means to mourn with the dead, what it means to listen to them, but then also to make sure that we're doing the work of contextualizing what has happened within these particular moments within a history that can't be ignored, right? And I think making those connections is very important when we talk about what it means to bear witness through an image. But this is something that would be totally different than what it means for people who would say, I'm going out into the streets because there has been an injustice, and this form of protesting, this form of being visible, and using my body and putting my body in this physical space, in this public space, is doing a type of work within itself. It's doing a type of witnessing within itself. And this testimony becomes very important, not only for helping Black people and others understand these social conditions, but it also becomes very important if we're thinking about what it means to engage in a politics of repair. And if we want to move towards reparation, and if we want to move towards caring for communities, how important it becomes to retrieve these experiences and give truth and light to them in that sense.
Thank you. So I want to remind all of our participants here today, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, questions, comments there. I'm gonna keep going because you know I have plenty. So you are clear in terms of your focus groups and your overall focus that you focus on particular generations and specifically generations of Black folks. But also when you're looking at the images, you see something much broader, especially in the last two archives. So when you ask the question, when we look at an image, what do we do with it? Who's your we in those moments? And which we's are you working at? And I know you've heard this question 50 billion times before.
Yes. Who's your we? We got to define our we. I mean, our we is quite frankly broad. In some sense, on a very minute level, when I say we, I mean anybody who comes to encounter the image. That is not exclusive to Black people. And though I am very interested in understanding the ways in which Black audiences are negotiating with the image, but those are almost for separate reasons. You know, racism is certainly not something that should be addressed as merely a Black people's problem. It's an everybody's problem. And so when we're talking about we're also talking about media makers. We're talking about journalists. We're talking about photojournalists. We're talking about filmmakers. We're talking about artists who will then therefore use the image in their artworks. What are we doing with this image? And this is a question that, again, I'm asking very honestly to a very broad audience as not only Americans or people in the United States of America, because there are also people diasporically who are engaging with the image and thinking about what that means for their own lives and what in the way in which it informs their own subjectivity as a Black person. And so we all have to bring our own lived experience and our own subjectivity, our own social position into bear on the way in which we understand ourselves as a we and whatever communities in which we see ourselves situated in, but then also, you know, how we are actually affected by it.
Okay, excellent. So Dr. Bennett Bailey is saying it's really clear that you are passionate about the topic. And do you have, if you were to give any advice to young scholars embarking on research, just starting out, how might you advise them?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it is passionate. And I think I would have to say, follow your hunch. So to quote, I don't know if Dr. Davis is watching, but to quote Sarita Davis, when I was in research methods, she would always say that research is me search. And I think it becomes quite important in the process of making these inquiries that we understand how we come to the topic. And if I'm being honest, you know, I simply came to it because I was troubled. Like, that is truly the honest truth. I was troubled. And then I was having conversations with other people. I was having conversations with my family, with my friends, and we were all disturbed. And so this was something, and then I saw these conversations happening in social media discourse. And so I knew that it wasn't just me who felt like, okay, something was going on here and something is important for us to talk about. And so follow your hunch, follow that thing that won't let you look away. Quite honestly, for me, I could not look away from images of Michael Brown's body. I couldn't look away from images of Ferguson years after they had happened, before I actually started writing about it. And so if something shows up in your life like that, I think it's somewhat of an indication that, you know, it's at least something passionate enough that you care enough about to follow it through. And then you just ask questions. And I think in my experience, those questions lead to other questions, which lead to other questions. And I don't know if we ever get, you know, all the answers, but we keep asking.
So this one's coming from Y Rush. During your research, what was a surprising response of your interviewees on their personal effects of bearing witness to continual displays of Black death?
Oh my God. Whew. So I don't know why you asked me that, Y Rush, because I don't want to curse. And, probably,
It's being
probably
recorded.
right. Probably some of the most interesting responses. I use a lot of people's actual language when I'm doing my transcripts. And that was actually probably the most enjoyable part about writing, is because, I didn't try to hide the things that individuals were saying. And some of it was, not things that, I would want to repeat in a recording. But one of the things that I think that touched me, I will share this. There was one particular participant who talked about, I was showing some images from the Racial Reckoning Archive, and there was this one particular one that they show, or they use, with a Black man, and he's taking down the Confederate flag in Mississippi. And this was a woman, 45-ish, and she talks about growing up in Mississippi. And a lot of my participants had Southern roots, even if, they weren't necessarily born and raised there. And she talked about how she never imagined in her lifetime that flag would come down. And she began to choke up, and she became very emotional. And I think we all became very emotional, in which she was saying that it was so heart-wrenching that in some ways she felt that George Floyd's death had to happen in order for this, this flag to come down. And I just, when I think about generational memory and I think about generational trauma, it was so much that was there in that moment. And then I had other participants who were like, to hell with it, burn it all down because it's trash. And I really resonated with that. And I think, there is no one right answer. There is no one sort of singular opinion. All of it has to get fleshed out. All of it has value. And I think that's probably the biggest insight that I've gained through this process.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you one more, because I know we're running a little bit over time. You've talked about in the work protest as an act of mourning, and we've talked about, the reparative aspects of photography and research as healing, right? So I want to say, from that first seeing in 2013, from the first writing about in 2018, what feels different about your approach to these questions and to the images now that you've written them out and done the work?
You always come with the best questions. You save them for last. I think you do this on purpose to me. I would say there's an evolution in my own thinking that I've encountered, which is quite intriguing to me, and actually being able to sit with that evolution. When you think about the reparative work, the possibility that is there, I found myself toward the end of writing, and I'll be mindful, toward the end of writing, and I'll try to be quick, was also the time after, we had a January 6th insurrection, that we had also lived through Derek Chauvin's trial. And it was around this time where they were going through these sort of deliberations. And then, this whole notion of what it meant for this young woman to bear witness. But whether or not she actually thought that that's something that she was doing, but why she felt compelled to do it. And I think that is sort of the question that stuck with me, and I've thought about a lot since. And I've thought about the people who are sort of debating what we do with this image. And I think there's something to be said about the reproduction of anti-Black violence that, I feel like I need to parse out more. It shows up in a particular time intentionally. It's no coincidence that we're talking about imaging and anti-Blackness when just last week we saw all those scenes that emerged from the southern border, this southern horror, this barbarism that continues to repeat itself because it's built into the cultural code. And that becomes the thing that is really motivating my thinking at this point in time. And so if we're going to move past that, then how do we change the code? And in order to change the code, quite frankly, we have to change knowledge as we know it. And that's where I find myself.
Thank you so much for your research and for being so open with it, Scholar Sanders. Thank you all for sticking with us tonight on a Wednesday evening. Next Wednesday, we're going to continue the Freedom School. We will have another Georgia State alum, Ms. Brittany Pradier, who will be, as Zena Sanders just mentioned, what was going on all this week. She will be presenting Black Migrants Matter, and she will be introduced by Dr. Sarita Davis. So thank you all for coming, and good night.
Peace.